there, and welcome to Flip the Script Season 2, Episode 11, How to Run Great Discovery Calls from 3 Completely Different Sources. Hand raisers through demo request, cold outbound, and postbound leads, which is everything in between. My name is Beck Holland. I'm the CEO and founder of titles that are way too long and Dickens style. Before we jump into the session, do me a favor, go to flipthescript.co and make sure you download the deck, because if you thought the session title was long, just wait till you see that bad boy. Once you've done it, let's go ahead and jump in. So let's start with a bit of an agenda. There's going to be 4 different pieces to today's session. Number 1, a discovery trek for hand raisers or demo requests. So this is true inbound from my definition. Full disclosure, I don't know if it's trek or track. So if you are the track side of the house, then you'll just have to look over the T-R-E-K. Number 2, discovery trek for postbound. If you don't have a list. Number 3, don't have a list of pain points that they were looking to solve. There's some cases where they will give them to you and some cases where they won't give them to you. So number 2 and 3, we're going to do a postbound discovery trek for if you don't have a list and then if you do have a list. And then number 4, discovery trek for cold outbound. So let's go and start from the top, which is going to be hand raisers. So the more detailed you can be, the better in terms of how you are customizing this, discovery call for the down to the source. But let's start with the steps. Number 1, I would discover 3 things from their call that they want to uncover. So in this case scenario, this is going to be a hand raiser. So this is someone probably who has done quite a bit of research. Forrester did a study on all of the different things that people seek out for information before they request a demo. There's a multitude of variables. Actually, demo is the last thing. A demo request is the last thing that we seek out, I would guess, because people want to research from the comfort of their own home before they go in with a salesperson. So you want to, whenever they come into the demo request line, typically they know quite a bit about your product. You know, there is a lot of background there. There's been some discovery on their end. And so when they are coming into the funnel, this is like if you were out in the ocean and the fish that are jumping in your boat. And really the inbound rep's job at that point is to gut the fish and understand if this is a fish that they can eat or not. So is this a qualified person? So you can do that through a multitude of ways. I would actually suggest a process where it is very buyer friendly that I go over in season 1 if you want to take a look. But typical programs are getting an inbound rep to reach out, typically within the first 5 minutes, or they'll have an aggressive amount of steps. You can circumvent all of that with the new inbound process, but let's just go for it. Pre-existing programs where they have an inbound rep who's jumping on the line. In that case scenario, when the inbound BDR is jumping on the line, that's the most average that I see, is they jump on the line with your prospect and they're asking a multitude of qualifying questions. So that can be, how many people do you have, web conferencing software, what's the integration stack look like, etc. But they're usually after what are the different things, questions that I need to know for this person to be able to buy from me, and how do I ask those up front to make sure to quote unquote not waste an AE's time. So I have a litany. I'm having heartburn right now, not going into the different theory of why that can be detrimental to your process, but that is what's happening on average. So let's go in that case scenario. Usually you'll have an inbound BDR who's asking those questions. And in doing so, they will kind of cover it up a little bit by saying, like, what's a couple of things that you want to discover on the call to make it feel like it was worth the prospect's time. So they will go into, so I have been researching your product for a while. I want to solve for these 3 things and I really want to go into pricing. And so if I was the account executive, the first thing that I would do is I would go into that call if I had a conversation intelligence software like Chorus. If not, then I would go into the recorded call if I was just using sales engagement like Outreach, or any way that the call is being recorded. I would essentially listen to that call and hear what the prospect is after, because at that point, they have high buyer intent and they usually want something very in specific. So I would uncover the 3 things from the call that they were looking to achieve from that time. And I would mention that to the prospect. I would say, it looks like from your qualifying chat with the SDR that you wanted to cover pricing, integration, and deployment in terms of timeline in our time today. Did I get that right? And I would look for confirmation from your prospect. So you're doing two things here. Number one, you're really looking for buy-in at the beginning of the meeting and making sure that that's what they want to cover. But you're also already proving to your prospect that you've done a little bit of research. So you have done what a lot of reps didn't do. You have really prepared for your time. And so it makes them feel like they don't have to double over in terms of the information that they have to repeat. So I have personally run into prospects before where whenever I quote unquote qualified them, by the time they got on the line with the account executive, they felt like it was a double over because the account executive was asking the same questions, that they didn't listen to the call. And they feel like the first qualifying call was a big waste of their time. So not a great foot to lean into in terms of the sales process. So, I would listen to that call as an AE and then say like, hey, here are the three things that I heard from your chat that you wanted to uncover in our time. Did I get that right? And look for confirmation. Number two, I would do a step called I call proof in the pudding, and I would casually mention a few personalized details at the onset of the call to prove to them that I know the company. So I'd say, again, from the top, looks like from our qualifying, hi, Ben, thanks for jumping on the line with me. Looks like from our qualifying chat with your SDR that you had yesterday that you wanted to cover pricing, integration, and deployment in terms of timeline. Did I get in our time today? Did I get that right? Ben says, yeah, you actually did get that right. I'd like to uncover those three things. And I'd say, great. Well, first things first, thank you for taking the time today. I did a little bit of research on your company Drift, and I noticed that you guys run a conference called Hypergrowth. I noticed that you are the sales enablement director, and that you've been over at Drift for only a few months now. So how's your experience been? So really, you want to diffuse the prospect by, instead of making it all about your company up front, that you want to prove a couple of personalized details to say like, hey, Ben, I'm really making an effort here to make everything tailored to you. So Ben feels like you know him. So he is likely to open up the kimono a little bit more, if that makes any sense. Number three, you want to ask them if they want to, once they've gone through this, I am the sales enablement director, and I have been over here for 4 months. Actually, my experience has been great. I joined Drift because I love David Cancel. I think the product is really, awesome. My onboarding experience was great, et cetera. And you kind of have a conversation casually. And at that point, once you've heard what I call the breath point, if you want to know more about what the breath point is, go into Silver Bullet Central, and I cover it in there. But once you hit the breath point of, okay, now I've done a little uncovering in this and discovery in this portion, I'm going to move on and say, okay, well, great. I'm glad to hear you've had that experience. I've always thought Drift was a great company. So I mentioned those three things that you wanted to cover in our time. Is there anything else that you wanted to add to the agenda today to make sure we make the best use of our time? At that point, Ben might say, yeah, I actually did want to know. He'll maybe be a little bit more open because you have personalized. I did want to know, you have these competitors, how do you compare, et cetera. And I'd make sure to write that into the agenda. Number four, I would double confirm with a pattern interrupt to make sure that there was nothing else that he wanted to put in. And the more you can pattern interrupt and be a human on the call with this person, again, you're trying to build rapport with someone who you don't know, and you're a salesperson. Salespeople are scary, and they're known as agenda-driven, and that they always want to always be closing, etc. And so we're kind of climbing over this hill of this person typically inherently doesn't trust us because we are a salesperson. So we are really trying to become a human to that person on the call right off the bat. So I would try to pattern interrupt and get out of that mentality, what I call the other car mentality, another silver bullet if you want to go to Silver Bullet Central and check it out. But I would say, something that's a little bit of off record, like, is there anything else you'd like to know before I go into some self-righteous monologue about how great we are? So you're really trying to dig into, the root of what Ben's after so that you get the full story behind the shield. A lot of people will come in and say, yes, I'd like to uncover pricing, integration, and I'd like to uncover, your deployment process. And really, behind the scene, they're evaluating you and your competitor. They really like your competitor and they're about to sign, but they just want to double check something. So it's like, that's the story that you need. That is the intel that you're after. So the 5 most important minutes of any meeting are the 5 minutes after the meeting has ended and you leave the room or leave the call, and they turn to their peer or their boss and they say, what'd you think? What are you really thinking in terms of, are we going to do this or not? So that is the type of information, clarity, and transparency that you need to grab by personalization, asking the right questions, and building rapport with your prospects. So this is a great way to pattern interrupt to try to get the real story of like, hey, is there anything you'd like to know before I go into some awful monologue, self-righteous monologue about how great we are? Like, that I can cover in our time to make sure that you found value from our time. And they'll probably say, yeah, so we actually are evaluating you against blank, or they'll come out with some level of detail. But if not, then you just move on. And I would add in step number 5, your agenda. So you've now said from the top, looks like from your qualifying chat with Cindy, that you wanted to cover pricing, integration, and deployment in terms of timeline in our chat today. Did I get that right? Ben says, yeah, you did. I say, okay, great. Glad to cover that. First things first, I noticed that you're, obviously from Drift, and I, have been following Drift for a while and did quite a bit of research on you and saw that you just joined Drift 4 months ago. Curious, we can get into this in a minute, but curious, how's your experience been so far? He's like, oh, they're great. Da, da, da. You build a certain level of rapport with him. You say, okay, once you hit that breath point, you say like, okay, well, I didn't call you to talk about your experience at Drift. So in terms of these 3 things, I'm going to be sure to cover these 3 things in our time. Is there anything you wanted to add to the agenda? Ben goes, oh, no, not really. And I'd say, okay, just want to double confirm. Are you sure there's nothing else before I launch into this self-righteous monologue about how awesome we are in our features? You sure there's nothing else I can cover? Just want to double check. He'll say, well, actually, now that you mention it, I would like to know X, Y, and Z. And I'd say, okay, great. Let me add that in here. Okay, great. So I know what you would like to cover during the call. And then step number 5, you want to add your own agenda. So I'd say, as far as what I would like to uncover in the call, I would like to uncover blank, blank, and blank. And you can put whatever items that you want to cover in that call, but you need to make your prospect aware of what you're going to cover. So, I would like to understand from the call, and this should be relevant to them. You mentioned that you wanted to know integrations. I'd be curious to know what kind of tech stack you're using. You mentioned that you want to know, pricing, which I will cover. I was curious off the bat what goal you were looking to achieve from buying a software like us. And number 3, I would like to know, what is your team looking to achieve? Like, what is the pain point that you are running into, or pleasure that you're after, that you would be willing to give me the time for today? Does that sound like a deal? So you want to get Ben to agree to the agenda items that you want to cover, because this isn't all about what Ben, wants to know. This is also about what you want to know. So to run effective discovery, most people seek out discovery questions because they think it enhances the ability to close the deal. I would say you need to seek out discovery questions because you have no idea what you're selling and why you're selling it unless you know that information. So I always want to understand where someone's coming from. And a great way to do that is in your tone is, I'm asking these questions from relatively agendaless. Like, I want to, from a curiosity perspective, understand their background, so that I know if they're going to use us, why on earth would they use us? So people usually are calling for a very specific reason of what they want to use their software, especially in the inbound line and what they want to achieve. It's very different for every prospect, regardless of what product you sell. So sometimes I'm looking to buy a fork because, I want a really, really nice fork to impress my mom coming over of I want the sterling silver set. The goal is to impress my parents coming in, and so I'm going to buy a fork. One case scenario, I just need a utensil to eat it with, so it might even be ice cream of hey, this is just the utensil I need to grab. Maybe a bad analogy, but 2 very different case scenarios. So you need to understand what the background is and what they're after with buying your software before you go on. The next part, I would agree to the time that's set. So I'd ask them, hey, Ben, we originally outlined that we have 45 minutes for today's time. Does that still work? And then I would set what's called a prospect pact for them. If you want to know more about the prospect pact, then you can go into the cold call session and the core sessions, but essentially it goes like this. So, as far as our 45 minutes a day, I saw that you wanted to cover these 3 things. I also wanted to cover this. And at the end of this 45 minutes, we'll typically run into 1 of 2 things. Either number 1, we aren't a fit, which is totally fine. I want you to feel okay with telling me no, and we can just part our ways as friends. Or, number 2, we do find that we're a fit in this time, or you are interested in learning more, and we can talk about next steps at that time. Typically, we blank, and I would outline the next step of what you want, hypothetically, if you are a fit. So you really want to put an ambit and direction around the call of like, hey, it's okay if we're not a fit, but if we are a fit in this 45 minutes, etc., typically the next step looks like this, but I will follow your lead. So you want to convey to them what the usual next step is, so it makes them feel confident that you know what you're doing, that they know the expectation here, and they can evaluate accordingly. But you also want to give room of like, hey, other people a lot of times don't love it when you are in control. When someone else is in control, when they feel like they can't get off the ride. So you always want to give a level of pillow of like, hey, but I will typically, number 1, the outcome would be we aren't a fit and we can part ways as friends in that case scenario, or if you want to be friends with me. And number 2, we do find we're a fit in this 45 minutes. And at that point, we can talk about next steps. Typically, what we see as a next step would be we would involve your sales development director, who I looked up and saw her name was Kathy. She actually has a pretty impressive background. But at any rate, that's usually the next step if we find that we're a fit. But I will follow your lead. But that's all if we're a fit. So let's see if we're a fit first. I would start with them on the back end. So after Ben agrees to that, he says, yeah, that sounds great. No problem. Let's dig in here. I would say, okay, great. If you could kick it off with, you mentioned that you were interested in integration. What did you mean by that? And I would start with their agenda items first. I know that we want to uncover a lot of information, et cetera, but I always want to take care of someone else's need before I take care of my own. So within reason. So usually if someone asks me some kind of question, or someone's after something in a situation, I've been in a situation in the last couple weeks where I needed something from someone and they needed something from me. And we are at the point in the tenure where basically I needed an answer. So I sent the person a text message and I said, hey, first things first, did you get blank? And I talked about their need. And that got an immediate response from someone who usually takes a little bit to respond. So I said like, hey, let's talk about your need. Did you get the thing that I sent over, where you were asking for X, Y, and Z? I just, to double confirm, to use for your team. And the person was like, oh yeah, I did get that. Thanks so much for asking. I'm like, what were you thinking about using it for? And they're like X, Y, and Z. And it really opened up the conversation that now they want to talk about the thing that I want because I started with them. So I would start at least with one point of one of the things that they want and then talk about some kind of question that you have. And then number 9, I would pattern interrupt my discovery is what I call it. I would say I would ask a number of questions at the beginning. Especially, this might be hypersensitivity because I've sold into salespeople for quite a while now. Selling into salespeople is a joy and also a very, very high bar because they know everything that you're doing while you're doing it. So they know the typical rundown that you should ask discovery questions, that you should hunt for pain, that you should get them to expand on those questions, that you should choke back pricing and you shouldn't talk about that too early, and et cetera, et cetera. And so a lot of people, I think the great thing about our prospects is they're very smart. So what I like to do is kind of classic role diffuse a little bit. And if you want to know more about that, head over into Silver Bullet Central where I cover more examples of it. But I like to ask a couple of questions and then at the end of that say like, hey, and I put an example here. I'll ask one more question and then I will stop with all the brutal discovery questions and just show you the damn demo. and then I'd ask my final question. So if you notice that they're getting a little antsy, you've been asking them too much discovery questions or asking too many questions up front and they just want to see the product, I would transition with that. So that is all very, very based on instinct. The better you can read, the more you can read the room, the better. But if you notice that someone like just wants you to move on, take all of their emotional cues and physical cues possible. I have a feeling that within the sales realm, or I've noticed people are very, they can read between the lines. You know, they watch a movie and the difference between a good and great actress is just a slight twitch of the eye. And by that twitch of the eye, we know that something is about to happen. Our instincts are high. And then we are a salesperson and we get on a cold call and we ignore all of those signs. We are trained to ignore all of those signs. So I would suggest flipping it. And if you notice that someone's getting a little antsy and they just kind of want to jump into the product, then I would say, hey, one more question and then I will stop asking you, battering you with all the brutal discovery questions and just show you the dang demo. But I did wonder, you mentioned X, Y, and Z, and it provides you the ability to ask one more question, but also provide self-awareness to your prospect that you know that they want to get into the demo and you will be there in a second. Step number 10, I'd run the demo for the prospect. I would, number one, zero in on what they wanted to, most importantly, covered. I know that we all have these awesome, decks, that are based on all the different features and products that we offer. But I would posit that if you're running and operating off of a deck, usually with someone live, you're missing a very, very important opportunity. So you want to essentially talk about at least first, but I would position in a lot of cases solely what they wanted to come to talk to you about in terms of your product. So usually they're buying your product for one reason, and they want to see a couple of different things, especially if they came on the inbound demo request line, like they're wondering competitive differentiator pricing and, how does this, I'll use Kaya, for instance, as a feature of outreach. How does that work and who does it work with? So I would zero in on those things and then say like, hey, did I cover this? Anything else you wanted to cover? But I would cover all the things that they asked for and requested for in the intro process with the SDR and with you when you asked them if there are additional things they wanted to cover. And then I lastly would transition into what you wanted to cover. So once you deliver value, once they have a need, if they want to see your product, especially on the demo request line, you want to add a little bit to the agenda, launch into the product, launch into discovery and ask a few questions that you need. If you see them getting antsy, then you need to go ahead and launch into the demo and say like, I'll ask you one more question and I'll stop battering you. Ask your one more question, go into the demo phase, present to them based on the things that they highlighted and they said that they wanted to cover. And then once they get their need met, it's like once someone's fed, you'll be surprised on what kind of human being they turn into. So they're like, oh, this person isn't full of crap. They did show me the demo. They took care of my need first. And so now they're more willing to open up. So I see a lot of reps handling pricing in a very interesting way where they're like, no. I'm going to talk about, only talk about pricing at the end. It's like sometimes if someone asks you a question twice, they say, Beck, what time is it? You say, that's a great question. Why did you ask? They say, what time is it? I'm like, 3:00. It's 3:00 because your likelihood of closing the deal at that point is higher if you just answer the dang question. Otherwise, they think you're being elusive. So in terms of the demo for the prospect, I'd focus on what they want. Make sure you cover all the things that they mentioned. And then I would lastly transition to the things that you need. So you want to feed them first, and then they will be more open to feed you back. Number 11, if they ask for pricing early, I know that we're all very, very sensitive about that, like I mentioned, and I get it. Especially if you are not the lowest bidder typically in the room, it can be high risk to talk about pricing coming from someone who isn't the lowest bid in the room. If they ask for pricing early, I would pattern interrupt and defer by calling that out. I would say, this is very elephant in the room and reading the room. I said, being an example, being a typical sales rep who wants to defer scary pricing to the end so I can build value in the meantime, would you mind if I covered blank in the first 20 minutes and covered a little bit more about your pain so I can get to know you a little bit first and then talk about pricing? And I would ask for their permission to do that. Some cases they'll say, no, I just want to know pricing. It's like, cool, $10,000 or whatever the thing is. But you want to ask them permission by pattern interrupting and be like, well, being the typical sales rep, or being, I sold a conversation intelligence software, and I would say, selling a platform that has the claim that we want to make sales reps better, I would hate to fall into the trap of talking about pricing too soon. Would you mind me asking, what were you looking to achieve? So I pattern interrupt by calling out the elephant in the room in classic role diffusing of being the normal sales rep who wants to talk about pricing at the end. Would you mind if I just got to know you a little bit first? And then I'm more than happy to cover pricing on the back end. And if they say, I want to know pricing now, I'd be like, okay, this is it. Because you have higher likelihood of closing the deal if you just answer that it's 3 o'clock at that point, because otherwise they will think that you're evasive and that you're hiding something best case scenario and that you're dishonest worst case scenario. So that is for inbound demo request hand raisers. So again, they're usually looking for something very finite. If they've requested a demo, Forrester research tells us, and dark funnel providers like G2 and review sites, that they are doing more research than ever before. So they're usually coming in. The inbound BDR is gutting them in terms of asking the qualifying questions. You need to piggyback on that, do your research, understand what they're after, and then deliver on that in the demo, pairing it along with questions that you are after. So that's inbound. Now let's talk about postbound. First of all, what on earth is postbound? And Beck, why are you making up words? Postbound is going to be anything that is in between a true hand raiser, like a demo request or someone who came in through a chat box, and true outbound, which is just cold, they didn't know you. So postbound is going to be, for example, someone who downloaded your content and the SDR booked the meeting based off of that. Someone who attended a webinar, someone who attended an event. The SDR, if you go to the account executive playbook and the comprehensive messaging guide or personalization at scale, I cover how to talk to those leads. Or in season 1, I talk about postbound leads and how to talk to them. But this was someone who wasn't a true hand raiser in the beginning. They downloaded content so they knew who you were. So I have the SDRs use the same amount of alacrity and personalization to that person of, hi, I noticed that you downloaded this piece of content, but more importantly, I saw you wrote this article, and they've personalized. So the person says, okay, you got me, I'll jump on the line and I'll hear about your software. So in this case scenario, you have a much less, the bomb's not about to go off, is what I'm trying to tell you. Is inbound, it's like, okay, there can be a high time intensive situation, whereas postbound, they weren't planning on being a hand raiser, but your outbound BDR hopefully did such a great job with personalizing and tying that to relevance that they agreed to take the meeting. So this is truly in between outbound in terms of the approach we'll take there, and inbound where you're really handling these high net requests, pairing along with what you need. And going into the demo. So let's go into the instance of you do have a list. And again, the list is going to be a list of things that they want to talk about. So if it's a webinar registrant, and your outbound SDR did a really, really great job of prospecting, sometimes they'll offer up what they want to cover on the call, and sometimes they won't. So let's start with, they did offer up what they wanted to cover in the call. In that case scenario, it's very similar to the inbound of number 1, I would do a content mention and I would, mention the SDR call. So great script that's here. Hi, Ben. First off, thanks for jumping on the call. I saw that you downloaded our webinar on inbound, postbound, and outbound tracks. Thank you, by the way. That's really, really motivating to the marketing team. I also took a listen to your call with the SDR, Kathy, and gathered as much context as I could for our meeting today. I'm curious, before we move on, how'd you like the article? And he'll say, it was great. I really like this point. Originally, I just downloaded it because I was looking for X, Y, and Z and blah, blah. But this is a good way to not just jump into the content right off and start some level of conversation. Step number 2 is I would uncover, this is again in the case that you do have, this track is for if you do have a list of what they wanted to uncover, meaning in a call with the SDR that was an outbound or a postbound call, but with the outbound alacrity, they said, yeah, I really actually did want to jump on the call with you and uncover, X, Y, and Z. How you can help reps personalize, how you can, help with a KPI infrastructure, etc. So I'd say in the second portion, after Ben goes into what he thought of the article, you would say, okay, well, great, glad to hear that. Well, I didn't call to ask for feedback on the article. I also uncovered from your conversation with our SDR, Kathy, that you are looking to cover, pricing, integration, and the use case for sales development leaders. Did I get that right? And look for confirmation. Number 3, I would casually mention a few personalized lines. Also on a side note, I've been doing quite a bit of research on Drift. Really love your company. I really love your company and saw that you've done hypergrowth and, all of that looks like really cool stuff, but you're really trying to prove personalization to Ben that you know who his company is. So number 4, it's getting very similar to our inbound track. Number 4, you're going to ask if they have any additional items. It's okay. Someone dropped something. Number 4, you're going to ask if they had some additional items. Scared me a little bit. So say, hey, Ben, before we move on, is there anything you would like to add to the agenda today? Number 5, double confirm with a pattern interrupt. He says, yeah, I'd actually like to add X, Y, and Z. I'd say, okay, great. Before I launch in his self-righteous monologue about how great we are, anything else? Anything else just to double confirm before we move on here? And I black out into my product pitch and he'll go, yeah, so really X, Y, and Z. A lot of times if you ask someone a question twice, then they will offer up more information. And then I would cover step number 6, the agenda items that I wanted to cover. So, hey, sounds great. We'll be sure to cover all of that. I have it all written down. As far as what I need, not to talk about my needs too much, but I was interested in these 3 things about your company. Number 1, what were you looking to achieve out of a software or out of a training service like Flip the Script? Where are you to date? And what's something that's top of mind of how you would like to get better to focus on? Just so we can, frame up if we were a fit, what that would look like. Does that sound like it's a plan for today's call? He will confirm. So you want to get him to buy into the agenda. I'd say, great, I have 45 minutes for today. Is that still good for you? Yes, it is. And I'd say, great. So Ben, one last thing before we launch in here. There's 1 and 2 tracks, 2 things that can happen as a result of our time after this 45 minutes. Number 1, we are a fit and we aren't a fit. And at that point, we can just part ways as friends. I am a big Drift fan either way. And, I'd love to still stay in touch. Or we are a fit. And at that time, we can talk about next steps. Typically, we would meet with a sales development director. I did a little bit of digging and noticed that that's Kathy. So typically, that would be the next step. But I will follow your lead. Does that sound good? Say yeah. And I'd say, okay, great. So I want to kick it off with you. You mentioned about integration. What did you mean by that? And I would go into the discovery call and I would follow the last steps from the inbound trek. First of all, pattern interrupt with the discovery. So once you notice that Ben is had enough of discovery and he wants you to just move on, I'd say, okay, I have one more question before we, go into the demo, and I will stop asking you all my brutal discovery questions at that point. But ask my one last question. I'd run the demo for Ben, zeroing on what he wanted to cover and leaving the riffraff behind. Cover all the things that he wanted first, and then go into what you need in terms of what you're looking to uncover. In my experience, you will actually answer a lot of your own questions within Ben's description. So you're leading with taking care of him first, but in doing so, a lot of times you're taking care of yourself, not only in terms of conversion, but also the questions that you need to ask. And then the last point is if he talks about pricing too early, I would say not wanting to be a terrible sales rep who doesn't cover pricing right at the onset when that's all you want. But I did want to get to know you a little bit first so I could, see what the appropriate pricing is. Would you mind if we left this until 20 minutes or did you absolutely have to have it now? And if he says, I want it now, I'd say, this is the price. And if not, then go ahead and run the discovery call. So that's if you do have a list. So Postbound, again, is going to be a content download, webinar registrant, etc. that your SDR reached out to, mentioned that, transition with it more importantly, and gave them a personalized premise and booked the meeting because of it. So in some case scenarios, and a lot of case scenarios for Postbound, they are going to be hitting them with a lot of different emails, hitting them with a lot of different cold calls and saying, Ben, talk to me, talk to me, talk to me, talk to me. I saw this thing. I noticed this thing. What if you could do this? Imagine you could do this. Here's an article, etc. And finally, Ben says, what? Makes me think of that Family Guy episode when Stewie goes, Mummy, 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 Mama, Mama, Mum, Mum, Mum. And finally Lois says, what? At that point, sometimes they will schedule a call, but they will give you no additional information. I might come from a different school of thought. I would say me and Keenan are actually very aligned in this reality. They are qualified, or they should be, because you are going after them. So from an outbound perspective or postbound perspective, if you're trying to call on someone that isn't qualified from the onset of what you can see, I would wonder why you are calling them at all. So at that point, if they say, what? Okay, fine. I will give you a shot Thursday at 2 for 30 minutes. If you ask qualifying questions at that point, then sometimes they will ghost you entirely. So at that point, I would say, great, send them the invite, give them a couple articles in the meantime to decrease no-shows, but you are essentially, I would not dig for a list. There are a lot of case scenarios where they won't give you a list necessarily of what they're after, in large part, often because they don't really know what you do. They've read your content, they think it's great, but they don't know all the ins and outs. So they, A, don't have really great questions at that point, but B, they don't know what they're looking to achieve. All they know is they liked the article, they liked this session on the different tracks, but they don't know too much about your business model, but they are willing to give you some time based on what they have seen. So in that case scenario, instead of pumping them for information, I would set the time, decrease no-show rate by sending over content in the meantime or value adds in the meantime. And then when you show up to the call, you are going to be running more of an educational call. They don't know what they're looking for necessarily. All they know is they really liked the content and they liked the approach. So in that case scenario, I would do this. I would say, hi, Ben, first off, I saw that you downloaded our, article on selling methodology. Thank you, by the way. It's really encouraging whenever people read our stuff. I'm curious, how did you like the article? Ben will say, oh, I really liked it, and, X, Y, and Z, or maybe, I just downloaded it because I wanted to see, something about, X, Y, and Z. And at that point, I would say, oh, great to hear. Like, thanks so much. I will pass that along to our marketing team, and I would base actually some of my conversation off of what Ben is mentioning. So maybe he'll say, yeah, so I really like the portion on asking better questions. I'd be like, oh, what do you mean by that? Well, our team over here, they seem to be asking some kinds of questions, but not the right ones with our prospect, if you know what I'm saying. And I would say, yes, I do. And I would get the conversation going at that point in the call, because you want to understand what he liked from the article, because that might give you some background on what he wants, what would be the right feature in this case, or the right trek to go in your conversation. Step number 2, casually mention a couple of personalized lines. I'd be like, well, before we dig in here, I've been following Drift for quite a while. I really like your company, love the Hypergrowth Conference, and I, look at David Cancel's content online, so really good stuff. And I noticed that you were a runner in the past. And like, oh yeah, I was a runner over at Stanford and blah, blah, blah. I'd be like, that was really cool. At any point, I would say, I heard the call where the SDR valiantly, booked the meeting with you and got the time. So I tried to gather as much context as I could. Curious, why were you willing to give us the time today? So at this point, you do not have a list of what Ben wants to cover. And so you don't want to launch into some full-blown demo, but you also don't know what to launch the demo on. So I would ask this question, curious, why were you willing to give me the time today by jumping on a call? So at this point, Ben will probably not only walk through what about the approach worked, but what he was looking to solve, what he thinks he was looking to solve by a hypothetically product like yours. So he won't know the exact features of your product. He doesn't know what he doesn't know. He doesn't know what he's necessarily looking for. So you want to understand people don't give up their time for free. It is the number one most valuable asset that you have, specifically within sales and specifically within leadership of any department. So one thing people don't have enough of. So I'd ask the question in that those words exactly, because you want to communicate to them that you value their time and that their time is valuable. So I'd say, why were you willing to give me a shot? Or why were you willing to spend 30 minutes with me today? Highlighting that their time is valuable. And he'll say, oh, well, I really liked this article. And honestly, the SDR mentioned something about X, Y, and Z. And I thought that was interesting. I'd be like, okay, cool. Anything else about the outreach? So you want to garner what was the piece that the SDR mentioned that Ben was willing to give you the time on the call so that you know a little bit on what to dig into. But there is a case scenario where, he'll give you one point. He'll say, yeah, they mentioned something about scaling accountability or scaling personalization. And I thought that was interesting, so I'd give you 30 minutes. I'd be like, okay, got it. That's actually really helpful. I have a list. I have number 4. I would give them a typical list of what people within their role usually care about on these calls. I'd say I have a list for what usually VPs of sales are after, what would be valuable. So I have that you were relatively interested in this personalization bit. Also, what I see VPs running into that we solve for, and correct me if I'm wrong or if I'm rambling and outside of the bounds for any of this, but they usually, when they come to these calls, they're looking to do one of two things: drive more pipeline or close more deals from that pipeline. Is that of any interest of you to you to cover also in this time? So I have the personalization bit, but do either one of those, would you be interested on how we solve for those over at Flip the Script? So, if you know your buyer persona and you're calling your shots well, they'll say, well, duh. Everyone likes more pipeline. Everyone likes to close more deals. I'd be like, okay, I'm sorry not to be, sales rep, but I will go into cover those points in specific of how Flip the Script solves for those. But I will start with personalization if that sounds good. Whenever Ben is talking, if he says, yeah, of course I would like those things. I also would like to know, what's the best voicemail that you could leave? How do I sequence actions? What does that sequence look like, etc.? So my team has typically struggled with playbook. I think that you have something to do with that, but I'm not sure. So I would like to, if you do solve for that, to go into that. So in that time, whenever Ben is talking, I feel like in the movie Hitch, when he says, when a woman is talking, you need to listen to her. When your prospect is speaking, you need to listen to them. So how you show listening is one of two things. Either number 1, you can shake your head, but that's not super effective because people who are extroverted, for instance, they can be staring at you, shaking their head, and not listening at all. Whereas an introvert can be staring off in the distance and they're listening to you entirely. So it typically isn't a sign to us that someone is listening when someone shakes their head. It's a better sign to us that someone is listening whenever they can repeat back what we said to them. I'm always impressed. I usually get goosebumps if someone can quote some detail of something I said to them that wasn't online for proof that they just remembered, because it communicates to me that they valued me enough to pay attention. So I'd say, okay, got it. So let me say this back to you to make sure I've got this straight. You originally jumped on the call because Cindy mentioned something about personalization. You thought that was interesting. You read the article, and the article was about sequencing, and you thought that was interesting as well. When it comes to your team, you are really focused on leaving great voicemails, writing better cold emails, and driving more pipeline as a result. And you would be interested at a high level of how we go into that to see if we're a fit. Did I get that right? And you want to make sure the better summary that you can give them, that you are repeating their words back to them, not only in terms of verbatim, but you can include some quotes that they said, but in terms of conceptually, then it communicates to them not only that you were listening, not only that you were listening enough to say it back to them, but that they can reasonably believe that you will do that in the future. I would add in your agenda items. I would agree on the time set, like in process 1 and 2. I would go through the prospect pack where I say we either aren't a fit or we are a fit, and this is the next step, but I'll follow your lead. Does that sound good? And then I would, step number 9, start with them, kick it off with something that they wanted to cover, and then back of the bar napkin math into the things that you wanted to cover for the things that weren't covered whenever they were talking. I would pattern interrupt if you're going through discovery too much and you've hit the breath point, you can tell they've had enough. I'd run the demo for the prospect, zero in on what they care about, cover all the things that they asked for, and lastly, transition to what matters to you. And then last step, just like the first 2 pieces, sorry, I'm going really quickly because we've covered this twice, but if they ask for pricing early, ask them if it's okay to default and get to know them first. If they say no, then give them pricing. If they say yes, go ahead and launch into the demo. So now let's talk about cold outbound. So inbound, we had a list. Postbound, sometimes we had a list, and it was an amalgam approach. Now we're on the other side of the coin. Postbound, where we didn't have a list, we have to dig a little bit. Why were they willing to give us some time? What did they like about the article? Why are they on the phone today? Why were they willing to spare 20 minutes or 30 minutes or however long the discovery is? Cold outbound, you need to dig a little bit more. Cold outbound, by default, you are very rarely going to get someone who spills their guts, especially to an SDR, about all their litany of problems, because they know, especially if you're selling into sales, the more they talk about pain, the more it triggers the cha-ching signs in your brain. So a lot of times people will choke back information because we have trained them to do that, because they don't want to open up everything about their business. So step number 1, I would say I would do the outreach feedback, meaning you have researched, I would prove to them that you have researched the outreach that the SDR sent to them in terms of cold outbound, so they feel like you are prepped for your time. So I'd say, hi, Ben, thanks for jumping on the call with me today. So I listened to the call with you and Cindy. Thanks for giving me the time today and for jumping on the call. You actually really motivated her by booking some time. First things first, did anything stand out about the outreach? So he'll say, yeah, so Cindy talked about X, Y, and Z, and I thought that was interesting. And I'd be like, okay, step number 2, you really want to drill it home with why were you so curious? I know your time is valuable. You are a VP of sales over at Oracle. You are head of, marketing. You are the VP of marketing over at Drift. Why were you willing to give me the time today? Out of curiosity. They'll tell you a little bit of what they were looking to achieve because they didn't give their time up for free. After they have done that, I would go into the typical list. Okay, got it. So that makes sense. And I would ask them a couple questions, dig a little bit deeper, try to make this portion to where you tease out information. The more I see a lot of account executives skip over this portion and then go into demo because this portion makes them nervous because it's variable and it's not written in the script. The more you can find out and hear, the better. I am after all the information in the world because I then know how to run discovery, or I know how to run the demo. I know what they care about. I know how to frame up the features. I know what they're thinking in terms of pricing. The more information, data. I can't make bricks without clay. So I would try and make this portion until they get mad and hit the breath point. Again, go check out Silver Bullet Central for more information about what that is. But I would try to make this portion not only so they feel heard, so that you can hear them. You can get that data. So I see a lot of different, sales gurus in the industry that say make them feel heard. You want to ask prospects questions so they feel heard and they feel understood. I'm like, well, right. But what if you just listen to them, truly heard them? The goal isn't to make them feel any certain way. The goal is to understand truly what they're after. So I'd make this portion as meaty as possible within reason of, they're going to hit a state of inflection point, especially if they're a decision maker relatively early on. And you need to be cognizant of that, read the room. And when they hit it, you need to move on. Great. Thanks so much for that overview. As far as our call today, I want to get into how we solve for that, and make sure that I uncover a little bit more about that. We typically also, with VPs of sales, I find that they're interested in wanting to know what the best subject lines are, how do they leave a voicemail in a way that gets their prospects to call them back, and how do they personalize at scale within their strategy so they can drive more pipeline in specific to their buyer persona and their roles and their industry. Is any of that interesting to you, or am I way off base? Or is there anything specifically that you want to walk away from this time knowing that would make it a good use of your time? So 2 ways to ask that, but I basically would give my typical pitch. There's nothing worse than coming on a sales call from an outbound perspective. You finally agree with the SDR and the AE's like, so what do you want to know? Like, what did you want? Like, ask me any questions. You're like, I don't have any questions. Run me through the show. Take me on the roll. Like, paint me a picture, sing me a narrative, hum me a bar. Like, I would come prepped with, we typically cover these things, but I would also beef up this portion and want to understand what they want to uncover. Step number 4, I would, again, listen to them, repeat back to them. Okay, I've got that you want to understand X, Y, and Z, and you also want to understand X and, X, Y, and Z. Anything else you'd like to add during this time? They'll say, yeah, I'd like to add, one more thing. I'd like to add X, or sometimes they'll just say, no, that all sounds good. If you've done a great job, usually they'll say that sounds good. I'd cover quickly the items that you'd like to uncover. I'd be like, okay, got it. I will be sure to cover all of those items. As far as our time today, I also had an ask. I saw that, you did this thing, or your team is doing X, Y, and Z. I want to understand a little bit more of what you mean about that. I want to understand what you would hypothetically, why you would be wanting to know what voicemail is the best, what you were looking to achieve by knowing that information, and what your your real goals are whenever you're evaluating some kind of sales training. Does that sound okay on the call? I'd wait for confirmation. I'd agree on the time set up. Looks like we have 45 minutes. Does that still sound good to you? Yes, it does. Run them through a prospect pack. Typically, we'll find 1 or 2 things at the end of this call. Either we aren't a fit and we can just part ways as friends if you're still willing to be friends with me. Or number 2, we are a fit, and at that point, we can talk about next steps. Typically, we would meet with your director of sales development and intertwine them in the deal to make it a little bit easier on you and, understand what they're after in terms of, pushing pipeline in Q4. But I will definitely follow your lead at that point. So let's go ahead and uncover if we are a fit before we cross that bridge when we come to it. So you mentioned this thing about voicemails. You mentioned this thing about wanting to learn how to personalize. What did you mean by that? I'd launch into discovery. Once you've asked enough discovery questions, this threshold is going to be smaller on outbound. Inbound, it can be longer, right? They came to you. Outbound, you barely earn their time, or you earn their time just enough to get them on the line. They didn't no-show you and they showed up. So the discovery questions, especially if they are situational, like how big's your team? They're qualifying questions. What web conferencing software do you use? If they're not valuable questions, you are shortening your rope. So you need to ask questions that are strategic, that actually help them uncover something or make them think about something in a way that they didn't know before. So I always love it when I'm on a podcast. I am always ranking in my mind the podcasts that I like being on, because the great podcasts, the people are asking me questions that I'm like, ooh, it's a great question. I've never been asked that before, and it's actually something that's really, really interesting. So if you want to know a great interviewer, Andy Paul over at Ring DNA, I actually just did a podcast with him, so it should be live by the time that you're watching this. But he asked me some questions that I have never been asked before. And I walked away from that thinking, me and Andy had one little call in the beginning, and I'm like, he has my full respect, and we left saying that we were kindred spirits, because I'm like, he asked some amazing questions, and I didn't know him beforehand. And so the more meaty the questions, the more strategic the questions, the better, especially with a decision maker or a leader. But at that point, once your rope has been run and you're like, this person just wants to know the pitch, wants me to, sing and dance, I would say, I have one more question, and then I'll stop, hammering you with brutal discovery questions and just show you the dang demo. But here's my last question. Choose wisely. I'd run the demo for the prospect, zero in on what they talked about, cover all the things that they talked about, and then lastly transition to you of what they didn't cover in the delta. I would, if they ask for pricing early, I'd defer by saying, I don't want to be that typical rep, but do you absolutely need it now? If they say, no, it's fine, go ahead and go into the demo a little bit and we'll talk about it later, then I would do that. And if they say, I want pricing now, in this case scenario, actually them asking for pricing is much lower. This is an education call in a lot of case scenarios. So they don't know what they don't know. And so if they don't know what it is that they're buying or why they would buy it, they certainly aren't thinking about a price. So in this case scenario, usually they won't ask for pricing questions, specifically not up front. Specifically if they're not a decision maker, like they know that the cost of something is dependent on the value, inherent value to me and inherent value and market value. So they usually won't ask you pricing questions because there's not necessarily high buyer intent. They're just trying to understand who you are and what you can deliver in terms of what they care about. So in summary, I know that it's very, very tempting to run all discovery calls the same. It's easy to do it that way, but it's harder on the back end and it's harder on your prospects. So the more information that you can know, the better, and the easier you can make the workflow for someone, the better, because it communicates to them, not only are you self-aware that you understand where they are, but you have done the research to know where they were sourced and where they come from. So the best sellers, from my perspective, is, and I'll give you an example and then we can end our session. There's a lot of HR companies out there who are outbounding certain candidates, and then there are some people that they are qualifying that have applied on the website. And then I have been that person who has been outbounded before where they're like, please just talk to us about this role. I jump on the phone with the decision maker or the person who's trying to qualify me, and they're like, well, why are you here? What do you like about my company? I'm like, well, nothing. Your recruiter pitched to me. I jumped on the phone. I jumped on the line because it sounded like, okay, I'll listen, hear you out. And now you're giving me the third degree as if I came to you. So the more that you can understand their buyer journey, the more you can understand where they're at mentally and what they're looking for on that call, the better. So a lot of empathy is being able to enter into the experience and buyer journey of someone, and how do I get them to the next stage and really uncover what matters to them. And the way that you can do that is specifically in a time like COVID. I think it's more important than ever before to know who our buyer is and where they're at along the way. So that is everything. Thanks so much everyone for watching. If you like this session and want to hear more, go to flipthescript.co so you can see a bunch of different sales topics like it, and so I can gate you as a lead and give you a great discovery call based on your source. And if you really like this session, go to Flip the Script on LinkedIn, tag Flip the Script to me in your top 2 takeaways so I know you want to hear more of in future sessions. But either way, I hope you have a great rest of your day.